the Old Testament. A little history. There were two kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south, that had been united under Solomon around 900 BC. And Solomon is the one who built the temple in Jerusalem and made the city the center of the religious, social, and political life of the Hebrew people. In the common mind of these people, God lived in the temple and watched over the people from that place. They came to the temple to worship God, to perform the ritual sacrifices required by the old law, and to pray for the things desired. By the time of Jeremiah, 300 or 400 years later, the northern king of Israel had been conquered long before by the Assyrians, and the southern kingdom of Judah had just been conquered by the Babylonians. And the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the invading army. Many of the Hebrew people were sent into exile in Babylon, especially the important ones, the elite, the priests, the rulers, the craftsmen. The common folks left behind had no one to look up to, no one to provide guidance religiously or politically. Neither group had a center. The temple was gone. Where was the God of the Hebrews? His home had been destroyed. The people were no longer able to worship God at the assigned place. There was no temple for ritual sacrifices. Where was God? Why had God not acted to prevent this disaster? Things were very different for the Hebrew people. There was much bemoaning of their fate, much beating of breasts, much crying out to whoever would listen. Where is God? How could this group of people retain their identity? How could they find God in the midst of all the strangeness? Where did God live among all the pagan temples and worship sites? The Hebrew people had been moved far outside their comfort zone. The center of their lives had been destroyed. They no longer had a central city, a central religious place, a central government. What was to happen to them? Jeremiah, who had been speaking out for a long time about what was to befall the Israelites and Judeans, sent a letter to the exiles. And part of this letter is what I just read. God's instructions for his people as revealed to Jeremiah. God is letting his chosen people know that he is still in their midst, that he did not actually reside in the temple, that he was wherever his people were, even in Babylon. God instructed the Hebrew people to live well while they were in Babylon. They are to farm just as they would have in Judah. They are to form new families just as they would have in Judah. They are to live and die just as they did in Judah. They are to make the place they now live better, just as they would have done in Judah. The people are to embrace their troubles and make good lives for themselves in spite of the difficulties and in spite of all the changes that had come in their lives. But God has not abandoned the people. Jeremiah goes on to provide God's promise for the future. The Lord proclaims, when Babylon's 70 years are up, I will come and fulfill my gracious promise to bring you back to this place. I know the plans I have in mind for you, declares the Lord. They are plans for peace, not disaster, to give you a future filled with hope. When you call me and come and pray to me, I will listen to you. When you search for me, yes, search for me with all your heart, you will find me. I will be present for you, declares the Lord, and I will end your captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have scattered you, and I will bring you home after your exile, declared the Lord. So God had a plan for the people in Babylon, in spite of all the changes and upheavals they are currently experiencing. And God has a plan for his people today. even when things change, whether we like it or not. So let's jump ahead a few centuries to the passage that Joy just read. The story of Jesus' ascension after his resurrection, another time of great change. Jesus had spent the time since his resurrection with his disciples. He was still a physical presence among them for these days. Now, however, he is ascending into heaven, just as he has always said he would do. The disciples would not have their leader with them anymore. How could they continue as they had been doing during the 3 years Jesus had been with them? This was a major change in their lives. For the last 3 years, they had been following in Jesus' footsteps, doing as he had instructed. He was there to answer their questions, to guide them when they were troubled, to be their leader. Now, he was gone from them. Luke tells us in that passage that Jesus told his followers to go about their business in Jerusalem, that he would send a new leader. They stayed in Jerusalem, worshiping in the temple and praising God. How can this be? The temple was destroyed more than 400 years ago, that we read about in Jeremiah. The people were exiled to Babylon when Jerusalem was destroyed. But remember what Jeremiah said. There was a future planned for the Hebrew people. 70 years after the exile began, excuse me, some of the exiles were released to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Although ancient Jerusalem never again became as large a city after the exile as it had been before, it still became a new center of Hebrew religion. It was different from what it had been before, but it was still the central place of worship. But the people had learned a vital lesson, that God was with them wherever they were. The temple was just a place, an important place, but was not the only place that God could be found. Jesus reminds his followers that having things as they had always been was not possible for them any more than it was possible for the ancient Hebrews. But again, there is hope for the future. Jesus promises he will send God's power to them, that they will not be rudderless, even though his earthly body is gone. Just like the ancient Hebrews, the more recent ones in Jesus' time came through major changes and challenges with God's leading and God's power. And just like the people of Jeremiah's and Jesus' time, the people of our time can do the same. We today still have the promise of a future. Regardless of what changes and challenges come into our lives, we will come through them and out the other side. Different, but still God's people. Sometimes the changes and challenges are major, being exiled into Babylon or moving into a different living environment. Sometimes the changes or challenges are minor, losing one's hair, walking slower. Sometimes the changes affect only us. Sometimes they affect our family. Sometimes they affect our community. No matter what changes come into our lives, we are still God's people in a place God has put us. Ourselves, our families, our communities will continue. We will come out the other side different. We'll have fewer possessions or less hair, or we'll have to do something differently than we did before. But we are still God's people. He has promised us a future, even though things will look different. Jeremiah and Jesus both